So welcome back. We are back again, I'm very happy to introduce this afternoon session, which will complement what you have seen in the morning. In the morning, we were more concerned about discovery, but there is a counterpart, which is conformance checking, and I'm really happy to present Boudewijn van Dongen from TUI, Eindhoven University, who would be leading you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josep. And let me start by introducing a deviation. We've just taken a picture outside, but Christine, the person that's actually organizing all this in the background, she's not happy with the picture, so she's forcing us to do it again. We are introducing a TOW move, a redo step, if you like. So on Wednesday, 7 o'clock in the evening, just before the party, we'll take a new group picture outside of the party venue. So please make sure you're all there on time for a new group picture. All right, then, welcome everybody to my session on conformance checking. That's me. That's the way I got to Aachen today, but it's also the way I got to Aachen the last time I was here for the ICPM conference that was shown, introduced to you already this morning. And this is a very nice picture because it shows you everything I'm going to talk about today as well as tomorrow morning. It shows you an environment. This is the beautiful city or country of the Netherlands, completely flat, bit of green, and empty highways. This environment, Germans understand, allows for going at any speed. Unfortunately for me, in the Netherlands, there is a model that says, no, you should not be going faster than 130 kilometers an hour, and these days it's even 100. Then there is a system, in this case a government, that records data. And this is data, some attributes, a speed, a timestamp, a date, my son's birthday. That's why I was in a rush. I had to celebrate his birthday before going to the conference. And then all this combination has consequences. In this case, 40 euros. For Germans, that's a lot. Now, meaning that traffic fines in Germany are usually cheaper. So what I just showed to you is a trinity, right? We talked about processes this morning. We talked about discovery. How do you get a process model out of a process? We talked about data, and Josep introduced event data, and nicely Sander showed how you get models out of very structured event data. But I'm going to talk about conformance checking. Like, how do we actually gain insights into processes by analyzing and interpreting data in relation to these models? And you've seen a bit of that. You saw the red lines in the inductive miner that Sander showed off. You saw that there are directly follows graphs with more edges than there should be, and so on. These are all differences between data and models that we're going to study. All right, but let's focus on this picture first. Who can tell me what the middle section here is called? Any suggestions? And for the organizing team, this is why I don't have the PDF online of these slides, because there are answers in there, right? So the handouts do not contain this slide. So what's the middle section? Any suggestions? Any consultants in the room? Yeah, no, the model's behavior is in the yellow circle. Value. So if you're a business owner and you talk to a consultant, then this is what he'll sell you. We call that a happy flow, right? This is how we think the world looks like, and this is how it actually would work if we're all point masters in a vacuum. Like models, data, and the actual process, this sort of abstract notion of a process, all nicely fitting together. Rarely the case. Even this workshop or this summer school, we're introducing differences between the process, the intended behavior, the model that is in the program, and the data will show that at least some of you won't make it in time to the group picture. That's why we have 2 of them. So how do you call the other parts? So for example, the overlap between the model and the process and the data, but not the model. So we're talking about behavior that we observe, stuff we see happening. That is actually possible in the process that we're considering, but it's not part of what we modeled. How would we call this? Any suggestions? Sorry, bit louder? Robin. Noise? Yeah? So in the Netherlands, this is a very common thing, right? If we can't do the things the way we should, we do them the way we can. Yeah, so this is not how we should work, because the model says otherwise, but it's possible. So you go 140 on the highway, and sometimes it has consequences. How about the top part? Just part of the process. Never happens, also not in the model. This is actually the things that this is how we can do things, but we generally don't, right? If you are a farmer and you own a tractor, you can go on the highway, but you generally don't. It's also not allowed. The model says you shouldn't, and you don't observe this very often, well, last couple of weeks. So all these things have these kind of interpretations. Here, things how we should do things, but we don't. The model says this is how you should do things, we just never do it. Data doesn't show it. We have, in general, very, very complicated rules. Our models, right, are far more complex than they should be. Then we have the traditional noise exceptions that prove the rules, right? Things happen, they're in the model, but they're not supposed to happen. Right? And we all know these kind of examples. And then my favorite, at least when you talk to business people, this is my favorite. This is the part that leads to percentages adding up to 300%. And report telling you made a revenue, even you're very certain you made a loss, right? That comes from data that's actually outside of the context where it should be. All right, that's a bit of a high-level introduction, but we have to take a step back. This is a summer school, so we start by really looking at some details down to algorithms today, and then tomorrow we continue with a bit more advanced topics. So I'm going to talk about token-based replay, one of the first techniques that did conformance checking, then alignments, finally synchronous products, and we conclude today with the notion of fitness. That's something that is very much related to recall in data mining. All right, so token-based replay, it was introduced a couple of years back, already quite some time ago, I think 15 years ago or so, by Anne Rosinat. Some of you may know her. You may have visited the process mining camp. She's been hosting this. She's the owner of Fluxicon, the company behind the process mining software Disco. And she, during her PhD, she worked on the notion of fitness. And the idea is actually very simple and intuitive. So we're going to play in and see how this works. You've seen battery nets now a few times this morning. Battery nets consist of places, transitions, and tokens moving around. We're going to make this a little bit more formal than what you've seen so far. But the idea is, if you actually execute a battery net, you fire transitions by consuming tokens and producing tokens in other places. And that intuitively means that if you have a sequence of steps recorded, you would fire transitions in that particular sequence that would match with the tokens being consumed and produced everywhere. And Anne realized that this actually doesn't work if the sequence of transitions that you've observed doesn't match the model. So she came up with a solution. That solution works well through some sort of bookkeeping system. It works well for basic Petri nets without these complicated tau steps that Sander talked about, without duplicating labels. So every transition has a unique label. And then later on, we'll also see more advanced techniques that can deal with these problems. But first, the basics. This is a simple event log. So simple event log, traces as you've seen before. And this is the process model that the alpha algorithm would actually discover if you give it this event log. So this is really the alpha algorithm applied to this log gives you this model. Now, to help you read this model a bit, we have the first activity is transition here, is an A transition. Then two things happen in parallel, B and C, and this is the power of Petri net modeling. We have explicit parallelism. B and C can happen in any order. Then D occurs, and then there's a decision, either E or F happens before we conclude the process with G. It's very simple. And now we have an event log that looks like this, and you can actually play these tokens, you can actually play these traces in this model. Right? It's one, I'm not sure if Sander mentioned that explicitly, but one of the key features of the alpha algorithm is that if there are certain guarantees on the data, you get a model that perfectly explains this data. And these guarantees are satisfied here. But what happens if I get a different model? This one. So what does this model say? You start with A, then B and C occur in parallel, but then you make a decision, either you do F, or you do D followed by E, and then the process concludes with G again. Slightly more complicated model compared to this one. The only difference is that if you do the F later, then the D didn't happen. In process trees, this would have been modeled with a skip over the D transition. But here, it's modeled as a Petri net. And now let's see what happens if we look at these sequences and start replaying them in this model. We put a token in the beginning, in the model, that's where we start. That's called a production, so we produced one token, and we simply follow the steps. So we fire the transition A, it consumes this one token and produces two. So it consumed one token and produces two. And we keep doing this. Transition B, consumed one token, produced one token. C, consumed one, produces one token. Then D, consumes two tokens, produces one. E, consumes one, produces one. And finally G, consumes one token, produces one. And now we're in the final state. This is where we want the model to end up in. And we have to remove that final token to get back where we were. So that's one more consume step. So overall, this is the bookkeeping that we do for this sequence. And if you add it all up, then you see that in order to execute this trace, not once, but 100 times, right? This is an event log that contains this particular sequence 100 times. Then in total, we consumed 800 tokens and we produced 800 as well. And this is a nicely fitting process model, right? The trace and the model, they belong together very well. But how about the situation that it doesn't? So let's look at the second trace here. We now go for the F transition. Now we start off the same way. We produce this initial token, and then we fire transition A, consume one token, produce two. We fire the transition B, consume one token, produce one. We fire the transition C, we consume one token, we produce one. And now we fire the transition D, we consume two tokens, and we produce one. Now we have a problem, because according to our event log, transition F should happen, but in the model, there are no tokens for the transition F to happen, right? In order for F to fire, you need a token in each of these input places, and they're not there. And the simple idea that Anne Rozinat had a few years, like 15 years ago, she said, you know what, I'm just going to put these tokens there. There you go. I fired the transition F anyway. But I keep track of the fact that I added these 2 tokens, missing. So I have 2 consumed, 1 produced, but in order to do this, I had 2 tokens missing. And then we continue. G happens, consumes 1, produces 1, and finally I need to remove this final token. So that's consumed, but I'm also stuck with this 1 token over there, right? From here, I have to remove the final token, but the token that is between D and E is now left behind. So I record that as well, and I add this to my bookkeeping table. So I have 90,000 consumed tokens. Again, the multiplicity of the trace here is 10,000. 80,000 produced tokens, but 20,000 missing and 10,000 remaining tokens. And I can continue doing this. So I introduce a token for the 3rd trace. 1 token consumed, 2 produced. 1, 1. 1, 1. 2 consumed, 1 produced. 1 consumed, 1 produced. 1 consumed, 1 produced. And finally, 1 consumed. And again, a fitting trace. And we see this is only 1. So we have 8800 here. And for the final trace, the story is very similar. We start with the initial token. We consume 1, produce 2. Consume 1, produce 1. Consume 1, produce 1. Then again, consume 2, produce 1. We have 2 missing tokens for F. And finally, we can do G. And then when we remove the final token, we'll also have to account for the remaining token. This trace was in there once, so I get 9 consumed tokens, 8 produced, 2 missing, and 1 remaining. Right? Fairly simple. No? Very simple idea. So this whole notion of token flow simply relates the model very directly to the data. Well, the model is supposed to be from this event log. Here is the event log. Let's see if it works or not. And we do some bookkeeping. So, small exercise. You all got pen and paper, right? So, here's a workflow log. Try to see if you can give me the numbers for the token-based replay. We look at the time. I'll give you a few minutes to solve this. I see some people trying to do this by out of the head. That's going to be challenging. So when I give these exercises to students in an exam, I always tell them to bring little things they can use as a token. on paper, right? Just pieces of an eraser or push pins or something like that, something they can use as tokens. Yeah, please. For the first trace, what are the token counts? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, very good. Anybody the second trace? Anybody disagrees? Yeah? Yeah, so I agree with her. Sorry. I also counted that. The third trace? Didn't get that far yet. 16, 16, 4, and 4? Almost. No. So we had 9 consumed, 8 produced, no missing, and 2 remaining. No need to take pictures. We'll share the PDFs with the answers later. But you can take pictures if you want me in it as well, of course. Now, so let's look at this one. This is a tricky one, I know, right? I did that on purpose in the exam that I took the exercise from. So the first produce this initial token in P0, so that's one production. Then you fire transition A that consumes 1 and produces 2 tokens. Then you fire transition C, and C is not enabled, right? We now have a token in P1 and P4. Then we fire C, so for that you consume 1 and you produce 1 and you have 1 missing token. Then we fire E, and E can fire because the token was still in P4. So you consume and you produce one. And now we have what we call the marking P3, P5. So there's a token in P3, there's a token in P5, and there's still a token in P1 that was left there from firing A. On P3, P5, you can fire the first F. So you consume 2, you produce 1 in P6. Then you fire F again, so you consume 2 missing tokens. So 2 missing, and you fire F. Why is missing 0? I'll correct it before that should not be 0, sorry about that. And finally, you remove 1 token from the final place, but the other one is behind. So that's the remaining token, plus the one in P1. So you have a remaining token in P1 and P6, but you have, I think you said 4 missing tokens in total. No, the remaining tokens is 2 of them. One in P1 and one of them in P6. Times 2, yes. Fair enough. Yeah. So this should be 4 and that should be 8. Good. See, that's why we do this. I'll fix that before we publish the PDFs. All right. Yes. That was produced by the A transition. Oh, there is a B here. Oh, sorry. I didn't fire B. I overlooked that. Right. Good spot. All right. Now, there's 2 problems with tokens, token counts, right? So first of all, this is very annoying to do when you do not know which activity was executed. Now I have A, B, C, D, E, and F. But what if I have 2 Bs? Which one is it? Right? And you saw the process models that were introduced before. There is no reason why in modeling you wouldn't use the same label twice. So you can have 2 transitions somewhere in your process model that have the same label. So that's a problem. The second one is if you have these tau transitions that we talked about earlier today, which ones should you fire and how do you count these tokens? Right? This is a very difficult problem. So in her PhD thesis, Anne had some heuristics to deal with that, but there was never a real true solution. And that's when a few years later, alignments were introduced. And alignments, they were introduced by a PhD student, Arya Adriancia. He started working on that during his master. But alignments try to solve this problem of not knowing exactly which transition to match with which label in the log by looking at it from a global point of view. And I'm going to show you this again using an example, but this time without the A, B, C's, and D's. This is a typical sort of Petrinet thing. You label all your things A, B, C, D, but this is a more real-life-like example. This morning, Sander showed you the data with the submitted and the activated labels. Did he also tell you what this data is from? Right, so this is a loan application process, and this is a model of such a process, slightly simplified so it fits on the slide. So we start with a customer submitting an application through a website. So customer applies for a loan. This is a small consumer credit, somewhere between 5 and 50,000 euros. And then the customer, what very often happens, cancels the application immediately. So you see, we start with application submitted, and then on the top, the application gets cancelled, and you've reached the end of the process immediately. Right? This happens on websites a lot. But if you go through, so if the application submitted continues, there is this ugly tau step, and that tau step makes sure that 2 things happen in parallel. There is an internal process of checking the documents that the customer submitted, and there is a process where a call agent calls the customer, agrees on the terms, sends the customer an offer, and then waits for that to come back. And the customer may say, I do not like this offer, so then you call them again, and that can go on forever. or the customer says, I reject this offer, I do not want to, I want to cancel this, or the offer gets accepted. And if the offer gets accepted, the loan eventually gets approved, right? So for that, both the documents need to be checked and the offer accepted. It can also happen that the documents are not correct, then the application will have to be rejected eventually, and this can lead to either a cancelled application, or if an offer was already accepted but there's something wrong with the documentation, then there is a decline application. If the loan is approved, we continue transferring the money and the process ends, right? Very intuitive process. We all have a non-ABCD, but a real visualization of this process in our heads. This is how a loan application process could work. And this is actually what the official, the original data for this process also shows. It's public data. We published that in 2012 for the BPI challenge. So you can really see this process with the slightly more steps, but you can really see this process taking place in a company. Now, what are alignments? Suppose you have a model like this, and you have a sequence of steps. So in your event data, you have application submitted, call the customer, send offer, call the customer again, approve the loan, and transfer money. Now, from the description I just gave you, I hope you realize that there are some steps missing here. But let's try to see how this trace still fits in this model. Well, application submitted, that's where we can start. We play the same game as before. We fire transitions. Now we see a call happening. And in order for that to happen, we need to execute this tau transition, and then we can do call. All right? Then we see send offer, and again, there is a token available, so that transition can happen. Now we see that again the customer was called by a call agent, and the model does not allow for that. So before, in token-based replay, we would now simply execute the call transition and assume that there was a token and record that as missing. But what would happen is that I then get 2 tokens in this bottom part, right? I get an extra token just before send offer. So now the model becomes very complicated. Instead, in alignments, we take a broader look, broader perspective, and we look at what is going to happen in the future. And we see that in the future, approve loan and transfer money are going to happen. And if you remember, they're up there, approve loan and transfer money. So the question now is, how can I fit this sequence of steps, match this with the model, to make sure that somehow this process concludes in an orderly fashion? And I can do that by saying, well, this call is in the log, but it's not part of the model. And I label this in yellow, and I say, well, it happened. Somebody called the customer, but they were not supposed to according to this model. It's part of the process, it's not part of the model. It is part of the data too. Then, in order for approve loan to happen, if you can see in the model, there's two steps missing. We have a check document and offer accepted. That somehow must have happened. Because in the end, we're transferring money to the customer, so I'm going to assume that in this model, these 2 things actually happened, but they fell out of the data. So, offer accepted, check documents, and now I'm in a state where again, approve loan can actually fire, and so can transfer money. So here I have an explanation of what I observed in relation to what I have modeled. And the cost of this alignment, as we call this, is 3, right? There are 3 deviations. The call agent called the customer while he wasn't supposed to do that, and the offer accepted and check documents activities seem to have been skipped, or at least their execution was not recorded. Depends a bit on the context how you should interpret this. If you're a bank, then I really hope that check documents is not actually skipped. well, maybe if it was my loan application, that is okay. But if I'm an accountant and I see this, I might have a problem with that. On the other hand, the offer accepted might also be a problem, right? Check documents is an internal issue. I should have done something, but I didn't do it. I can always do it afterwards, right? Do check documents still, and if everything's okay, we hide this. But offer accepted is also an interesting one. That did not happen according to the data, but I did transfer the money. So what would you do if you never signed an offer and the bank sent you 50,000 euros? I would probably say I never got this 50,000 euros, right? So that is a problem. So how do you interpret this? That is a challenge, but we'll talk more about that later. These alignments, they have three very important fundamental properties. First of all, the top part, application submitted, call, send offer, call, approve loan, and transfer money, is the exact sequence of steps that was recorded in the data. So I can reconstruct the data from this alignment. The bottom part is a full execution of the model. Right? It's actually a sequence of steps that I can fire in the process model. If I would take the bottom part and do token replay, I would have perfect fitness. No missing and remaining tokens. And the third property here is that there is no other explanation of these steps with fewer deviations. So I can guarantee that no matter how you try, you will not be able to fit these 6 events in this model with fewer than 3 deviations. There may be others, but you can't fit it with fewer than 3. And that's what we call an optimal alignment. Now, how do we get those? It's a little bit of a challenge computationally, but I would like to give you the intuition behind this. So we've now seen this token game a few times. And actually an alignment is nothing more than a token game in a different model. So we take our process model, we make it a bit smaller to make space on the slide for the rest. We also have our trace. The trace that we observed, application submitted, call, send offer, call, approve loan, transfer money. Now, I'm a Petrinets guy. I know Robin already for a very long time. So we love to make everything into a Petrinet. I always tell my students that by the end of my class, you should sort of feel like you're in the matrix. Right? The walls are not green numbers, but the walls are Petrinets. So I make this into a Petrinet. Very simple one, but this is a Petrinet representation of the trace that I actually just observed. And I'm going to combine the two, put 2 tokens in there, and I'm going to give them the colors that correspond to the parts that we just saw in this alignment. So these are yellow, meaning if I fire this transition, I'm indicating something happened in the log that I can't explain in the model. The top part, I make purple. Right? The model, something should have happened, but I did not observe this. And now all that's left to do is to make the synchronous combination of the labels. So application submitted happens both there and there. So I'm adding a new transition that combines these two in one action. And I do that for all the steps in the model that have the same label. So it doesn't matter whether there are duplicate labels up there, right? Multiple times, that's perfectly fine. I just take the Cartesian product, so make all the possible combinations. So I have one call here, send offer, another call, approve loan, right? It connects to 3 places up there and 2 down here. And finally transfer money. And these are the so-called synchronous transitions, the green ones. If I fire one of these transitions, they indicate something happened in the model and in the log. So I can match the two. Then I associate a cost function to this model and say, well, firing a transition that costs me, the green transitions are for free. The small black transitions, the tau steps, are also for free because I can never argue that they did not happen because I didn't see them. You're not supposed to see them, so it's fine. But firing any of the yellow or the purple transitions, that is something that actually costs me. And now what I'm looking for is a sequence of steps to get from the initial 2 tokens in these 2 places to the final marking, the final state, 1 token over there and 1 token over here. And once I've reached that state, I have explained this sequence. And I do that with minimal cost. And that's again not a trivial problem. So find an execution sequence such that the cost of the transitions is minimized. So how do you do this? Well, very much in the same way as this guy does that when I want to go here on a motorcycle. Like you all have one in the car, I guess. Right? Simple navigation device. It uses maps. Not much different from process, well actually much easier than process models, but don't tell my algorithms colleagues I said that. And they're flat, so they have a 2D layout. These process models are far more complicated. But I'm going to actually traverse the map of this synchronous product. So how I'm going to do that? I left out half of the synchronous product. That half will come back in a minute. But first, what is the behavior of this process model? Well, this is my initial state. And the 0 here indicates the cost of firing transitions from this initial state to reach that state. Well, the initial state is 0. But then I can fire application submitted and I reach a state 1. You saw in the past speakers they use small labels, AS, to denote which transition actually fired. I left the labels out and you will see in a minute why. So this state I can reach with the cost 1. Then I can fire the cancel application and I reach my final marking, a final state of the model with cost 2. I fire 2 purple transitions. I can also fire this tau transition. Tau transitions are for free, right? So I have still cost 1 to reach this. Then I can fire call. I get cost 2. I can fire send offer. We've seen this before. I can fire offer rejected and I go back to a state of the model that I have been in the past. I can also execute the check documents. And then I can continue doing this, continue firing transitions in this model in order to build what we call the state space of this model. This is the full state space of that process model. So this is essentially a map of all the possible ways you can get from the initial marking to the final marking. And it indicates the cost, what is the shortest path, just like a navigation device does. It takes the shortest path to get you from one place to the other. And the cost function that we use is deviations. The cost function that device uses has to do with road category, speed, etc. We're not there yet because we still have a bottom half. So how about this part? Well, let's first look at the yellow. In my initial marking, I can fire application submitted. And what happens is I move to the left. So that with cost 1, I can reach a new state here. I can also do a synchronous move. In a synchronous move, I took the token from application submitted, the token from this place as well as from this place. I fired the synchronous transition, and now I have a token here and a token there. And that has cost 0, so the distance from the initial state to that one is 0. But of course, I could have also done the yellow transition application submitted first, and then the purple application submitted. I would have reached the same state with higher cost. So I'm just looking for the shortest path. That's what the cost came from. Now you can continue doing this, so you can also, now that you've done application submitted once, you can fire anything in the model. So this structure is repeated here. And funnily enough, in any of the states on this side, I can do the application submitted and move to the corresponding state on this side. So get a lot of these yellow transitions. And I can continue doing this. This explains the call, send offer, call, approve loan, transfer money. It's the ideal sized model. Anything more wouldn't fit. So this is the full search space, the full map of this particular trace and model combination. And what we're now looking for is the shortest path to get from this state here to that state there. Now, it's already shown here that it is a distance 3, and you all see this path, right? It's staring you in the face almost. Like there it is. We've seen that before. With cost 0, we do application submitted, then the tau, then call, send offer, then we have the yellow call, then 2 purple transitions, offer accepted, check documents, approve loan, transfer money. It's the shortest way to get to the final marking. And it has length 3, we already saw that, but it may not be unique. There's another path that gets you with cost 3 to this final marking. And this has to do with the fact that this check documents transition is actually in parallel to a large part of the model. So, exercise. Take a few minutes, try to draw this synchronous product for this particular model. Synchronous product for the trace DEBF. In this model, I should have asked the organizers to give you coloring pencils as well. Yep, please. Sorry? Yes. Yes, there are 2 Ds in there. That is correct. And the tau step. Because alignments don't care, they can deal with that. But remember, when you make a synchronous product, there is also a D up there, so you can synchronize this either with this D or with that D. So that means you will get 2 of these green synchronous moves in your synchronous transitions in your model. Yes. Try to find the optimal one with the lowest cost. For this, you don't need to draw the entire state space for this model, right? Yes? You solved it? Yes? All right. So, could you tell me what the costs are to get? Optimal cost is 3. Any other solutions? 2? 2? Who votes for 2? 1? 2? 3? All right, let's have a look. So this is the synchronous product that we're looking for, right? First of all, notice that there is precisely what you already asked. There is 2 Ds, 2 synchronous Ds, right? One synchronizing the trace D with the middle D, and one synchronizing the trace D with the bottom of the model. Then we have the E in the trace that doesn't appear in the model at all. Right, so that one we can't synchronize. Then on the top, so then we have the B here, the B that is synchronized with that B from there, and we have F that is synchronized with this F here. Right? Now, how do you get to the final optimal sequence? Total cost you will find has 2, not 3, right? So what is the sequence that has this? It's highlighted in red. So you have the A in the model. The A doesn't appear in the log, and you need to start the model with that anyway, so it needs to happen. And you also have a deviation on the E, because it doesn't appear in the model, so it must be a deviation on the log. So these 2 deviations I know for sure are going to be there. And now, interestingly enough, the rest is actually fitting. Because I can do the tau transition, followed by the synchronous D, this one. That means I consume the token in P6, in P3, and in the start of the trace, and I produce it in P4, and in P2, there's an arc missing, I see, as well as in the bottom. Then we have E, then we can do the synchronous B, and finally the synchronous F. And that means that we have a total cost of 2 for this. No, sorry, it's sorry. There is no arc missing. It's the bottom D that you synchronize with. Token from P3 to P4, and the top P6 to P2 is done by the B transition. And then finally you have the synchronous F. And this must be an optimal solution because, well, I already reasoned that E and A have to be deviations, and I don't have any other, right? So this must be an optimal solution. And the 3 probably comes from counting the tau transition as well. The other D, yes, if you do the other D, then you have more deviations, correct. Yeah, yeah. All right, good. Well, if there are 2 Ds, like you see here, then you get many more of these intermediate synchronous transitions. Simply means that the search space that you're looking for is growing and growing and growing. So the problem becomes harder and harder. But you are always guaranteed to find an optimal alignment from the initial to the final marking. And how we actually do this for now, let's leave this. We'll look at that tomorrow. But first, today, we should talk about why we do this. So far, we've been talking about the relation between a model and a log, but why do we actually want this? I mentioned already in the beginning that fitness is a term that you see a lot in process mining, and it's very much related to what we call recall in data mining. So if we have a model and data, then fitness quantifies to what extent this model actually explains the data. Like a perfectly fitting model, fitness 1, means it can reproduce all the sequences that I have observed. So generally, that is, intuitively, that's what you want. We saw this morning the slider, you're moving this up and down. Moving the slider down, you get simpler models, they look nice, but they do not explain the data. Now, fitness is a measure for actually quantifying that relationship. Fitness 0 means your model is completely from a different world. Fitness 1 means your model actually explains the data. So how do we compute fitness? Both token-based replay and alignments can give you a fitness number. They are different numbers, but they both give you a value between this 0 and 1 scale. So for token-based replay, in a perfectly fitting sequence, the number of missing and remaining tokens is 0. You never had missing tokens, and there's nothing left behind. You also know that you can never have more missing tokens than that you actually consumed, because you only have a missing token if you consume it, and you cannot leave tokens behind that you did not produce. Right? So these are the bounds, and that gives you a very intuitive formula for fitness. A model explains the trace through this formula, so that is a trace-based fitness, 1 minus missing over consumed, plus 1 minus remaining over produced, divided by 2, or times a half, both of them. And for a log, you can do exactly the same. So you could average the trace fitness, but you can also average or take the total counts. These are two different numbers, by the way. So trace fitness explains the fitness of a particular model with respect to a trace, and log fitness explains the fitness of a model and a log. And the average trace fitness is again another value. This model we saw before as the example. So how would we now come with a fitness value? Well, for these two traces, there are no missing and remaining tokens, so fitness is 1. And for the other two traces, the formula actually gives us a fitness value of 0.549. For the log as a whole, this is the sum, this is the formula that you solve, and then you get 0.828. Does that mean anything? Not sure. But it's a number. It's a metric. So we can say something about fitness. We can do that as well with alignments. If we have cost 0, means we have a perfectly fitting sequence. We only fired green transitions and maybe a few black ones. So that's perfect. But what is the upper bound for cost? That's where it becomes a little bit more challenging. So what will be the upper bound for costs? Now, look at this model again. Now think about how I can, what is for sure guaranteed a way to reach the final marking, regardless of optimality? Well, on the bottom, I can simply fire all the yellow transitions. So pretend everything I saw is not according to the model. And on the top, I can say, well, what is the shortest execution of the model? And this gives me an alignment. I've reached the final marking here in the simplest possible way. We call this the best of the worst alignment. So you have only, you say, whatever I saw did not happen in the model, and whatever, I just executed the model without looking at the data in the shortest possible way. So that's what this is. You can do this for every model trace combination. Right? And that's why this gives an upper bound. It's not ideal, right? There are researchers who claim, rightfully so, that this has problems because you can make small changes in the model and completely change the fitness, but fair enough. Then you take the combination of the two for trace fitness and you divide the cost over the best of the worst, and then of course 1 minus. If cost is 0, you have an optimal alignment. So you have a maximally fitting model, and the cost can never be worse than this. Right? I cannot make an alignment with cost 9 because that would be not optimal, because this is more optimal. Right? So this, for this trace, the fitness would be 0.625. Again, it's just a number. Similar to token-based fitness, we can do this for a trace. We can also do this for an entire log. Right? You sum them up. And again, log fitness is not the same as the average trace fitness. Important to realize this when you play with tooling later. Always question what fitness is actually reported. For this example, if I do alignment-based fitness, I get a fitness of 0.9099 and a bit. So different fitness calculations, same example, I just get a different number. All right. Now I have 3 models here. I still have the same log that we have been looking at. I get 3 different models. So the top one is the alpha algorithm, produced this. The middle one, there is no parallelism anymore between B and C. I said, well, you first do B and then you do C. And in the bottom model, the E is sort of hanging loose. Right? And hanging loose in the PetriNet terms means it can happen anytime, anywhere. This is like the more elaborate version of adding cheese to the pizza. You can here even add cheese to the pizza before it goes in the oven or after it goes in the oven, or even when you already ate it, you can just add cheese and I guess eat the cheese then. So which of these models is best? Any preference? And the first one? Yeah, it is very nice, right? We like that model. I would agree in this case. Yeah? So in this particular example, it's very good. How about the second one? Thank you very much for that answer. So she says, yeah, but the second one is actually quite okay, because in the CB combination we only see twice, whereas the BC combination we see 10,100 times. So the alpha algorithm completely abstracts from these frequencies and says, if I see something happen in a particular order once, I'll put them in parallel, right? In arbitrary order, I'll put them in parallel. But you're arguing, well, this is so infrequent, maybe it's not supposed to be that way. And then I go back to what we started with. Context matters. It depends very much on the actual process you're looking at, whether the top model is better or the bottom. If I'm doing an exam on the alpha algorithm, the top model is better, because the bottom model is wrong. But if I'm looking at a business process where you should first file a travel permit and then go on a trip to Aachen, and in 2 or 3 times it happens the other way around, it would be very bad for the algorithm to suggest, yeah, you should just file your travel permit at any point in time, even if you already traveled, right? That's wrong. So it depends on the context. The bottom model, yeah, there it becomes more tricky, right? We've never observed that the E is not actually happening or happening more than once, so why would we have this in the model? And so that is probably a model that we do not want to see, yet, that's why it's here, the fitness metric says the fitness is 0.999. Yeah, so fitness is nice. It's a very nice metric. Various fitness metrics, but please do not rely on them blindly, right? Because it's in the, I don't know, 17th digit or so that they start differing. But this is clearly a worse model than the other two. All right. So before you did token-based replay on this model, you counted the tokens. So what is the fitness? Let me look at the time. I'll give you a few minutes to compute the fitness here. With the correct numbers for missing and remaining tokens, right? I changed the slides in the meantime. All right, anybody got the log-based fitness number? Not yet? How about this one? So, 60 consumed, 60 produced, 10 missing, 10 remaining. That gives you a trace fitness of 0.83, right? It's easy to see. This is so this is half times 1 minus 1/6 plus half times 1 minus 1/6, so that's 5/6, which is shown there. And the log fitness is simply the same formula, but now over these total numbers, right? The total row. And look, I included the 4 missing tokens that we were missing before. Yeah? So that's another thing you always should bring to an exercise for process mining is a calculator. You don't want to do this by hand. And sometimes actually students complain that I didn't make these things so that they could do it out of the top of their head. But that's not how process mining works. Then how about the trace-based fitness for this model and the trace that you saw before? Remember the synchronous product. We established that it has a cost of 2. So what is the fitness, the trace-based fitness for this model? .6. Other guesses? Calculations? .5. Who bids more? Five divided by 7? Anybody else? 5 divided by 7? Yeah? So, just like with the token-based fitness, we had everything we needed in the token count. But for alignments, we need to have this best of the worst type of trace. And in this case, the quickest way to execute the model is by firing transition A that produces 2 tokens, P1, P3, then transition D that consumes these 2 tokens and produces P2, P4, and then F consumes P2, P4 and produces P5. So the best of the worst alignment has the 4 yellow steps below and the 3 purple, what we call model moves, and the yellow ones are called log moves, and the 3 model moves on the top. So that is 7. That means the fitness is 1 minus the cost divided by 7. So 2 over 7, that means 5 over 7 is indeed the fitness, which is 0.7142. 43, right. So, fitness. All right. Then, to summarize, we have fitness as a notion for what we call recall in data mining. Yeah? It gives us a value, a number to interpret how well a model explains a data set. This can be a model that we get from the alpha algorithm or the inductive miner. It can also be a model that we make by hand. Commercial tools such as, for example, UiPath's tooling, they allow you to draw a model and then do this kind of analysis on that drawn model. The quality of a process mining result is not the same as the best fitness. Because if that is the case, then I have the perfect mining algorithm that will always produce this model with sufficiently many labels, right? This is what we call a flower model, because if you ask your children to draw this, you can draw it as a sunflower with nice leaves. And this is always perfect fitness. It can explain any trace, and it holds no information. So fitness is not a measure for how good a model is. And we saw the very nice example also with the 3 models, where one was clearly not so good, but the other 2 you could actually argue that they were better or worse. We have a method, 2 methods, token-based replay and alignments, to relate traces and models, and alignments are the more robust version, computationally expensive though, and we can compute both trace and log-based fitness metrics. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more in depth about how you actually do this. I'm not going to ask you to play out the algorithms by hand, right? So for that we have software. We'll also see how you could do this with software. So Prom Lite, you've already been introduced to it. Sander showed you that. I will give you a bit of the steps to follow to actually do this with a real-life data set. So real data, a real model, not man-made, right? Real data. But I will not do a demo, because I was explicitly asked not to, but yeah, Sander deviated. He did something that he was not supposed to do. So if you do an alignment on that, you actually would get a log move. You observed that he did something, but the model said don't do a demo. So he did this. With that, it's time for questions. Please. Yes. With just one place in the middle with a token in it, and then the leaves are all the transitions. Yes. Yes. That's it's a very good comment. So you can make a more general process model, but this is the workflow model version of a flower model with an explicit beginning and end. But you can also make the A and the G tau steps, right? So there's all kinds of variations. You're right. Yes. Please.
Thank you so much for the inspiring lesson. And I had a question about the cost. I was wondering, is it really fair to assign the same cost to the model misalignments and to the log? Because I would say that it's also use case specific, right?
Yep. It's a very good question. So in none of the papers about alignments, this is very explicit. But if you actually read the PhD thesis that Arya Adriancia wrote, he separates these two concepts of costs into a cost that we talked about today, so the cost of introducing an alignment in the underlying sequence, and a cost that is actually the cost of deviation at the business level. So he separates these two. So what happens if you, of course this is all configurable. Also in the software you can set the cost to any arbitrary number. However, what would happen if you pick now let's take the example of the money being transferred, right? So you set the cost of the model move money transferred very high. What happens is that the technique will always try to find an explanation where that transition is not fired in the model. But intuitively you would say, well, give it high cost because we don't want that to happen. But we're not explaining what we want to happen. We're trying to explain what actually happened. So you might get an explanation that hides the underlying problem, namely that money was transferred, even though it should not have been. So, yes, you can play with these costs. There are also plenty of papers, more recent ones, where this cost function plays an important role. So if there are mismatches in the data perspective or on the resource perspective, somebody executed the task but didn't have the role or the authorization to do this, you can all assign different costs to it. But you have to be very careful what it actually means, whether this is the algorithm that you're trying to steer or whether this is the interpretation that you're trying to do. And these two you should try to disconnect. So.
Thank you very much. With the techniques that you showed us, we always only look at the control flow of the process. But there might also be other dimensions of the process. Do you think it would be helpful to consider this for conformance checking? And can you recommend any techniques, maybe?
Absolutely. So there are, yes, we focus also today and also tomorrow, we focus primarily on the control flow because that is the foundation. There is quite a bit of work on other perspectives. Typically this is done in two steps. So first the control flow is aligned And then the alignment itself, so the artifact that I showed you, this sequence of moves, that is used to also look at the other perspectives. Resources, who did what, data, right? Which data was accessed and why. More recent work is the work of one of the PhD students in our group, Azadeh. Don't ask me to pronounce her last name, I'm sorry. But she has been working on the idea of looking at the same problem with data and resources and roles and authorizations and data access all in one go. And yeah, the challenge is that this graph that I showed you that barely fit the slides, where we're looking for the shortest path, that becomes significantly larger. And that means the problem of finding the shortest path also becomes significantly more complex. In a similar fashion, Dominique Sommers is trying to not look at one trace in isolation, but the whole log at once. So how do you do that, right? So of course there are processes where you have, I don't know, a machine, and there's only one of these machines that goes through the process. So you want to highlight that when looking at cases, not in isolation, but across the case boundaries. The problem just becomes increasingly more complicated, and then also the algorithmics become far more interesting to research. Definitely a very interesting research direction. Yeah?
Hello, hello. Yeah, thank you for the interesting presentation. I would like to ask from a more practical point of view. In practice, when you work with industry or whatever, how do you come to the conclusion whether you discovered a good model or not? When we've seen in the example that the fitness is not always the only thing to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the nice thing is that if you do this in practice, you're always talking to a process expert that is typically into the process you're looking at. We've had instances where you make these spaghetti-like models, right? Sliders all the way up. And then you present this to a doctor and he immediately says, that cannot happen. Like, so one of these very tiny arcs somewhere in this model, he said, that cannot happen. We're really not allowed to do this. Well, yeah, but it happened, right? And you can drill down to the actual case and there's always an explanation. And then, yes, but that is Mr. This and this, and he is 75, and he has this side condition, and this condition, and this condition, so we can't do anything else but to break the rules, right? Same with the banking example. So the financial log, we'll see more of that tomorrow, but also that has deviations that actually have a physical explanation, but you, as a process mining expert, can't find this. You need the person that provides the context, you need the person in the loop. So this process mining will never become an automated activity. It will always be interaction between you, the miner, and the expert that actually owns this process. And which model is better? Well, again, it's about the purpose, or the context. So a model that explains everything that happened can be nice to use. Show to a department, say, well, this is how you're executing our processes. This is the handbook that we have. It's nicely written down, like beautiful pictures and BPMN models, ISO 9001 certified, but this is how you're actually working. And that's very nice. But it doesn't help you to spot where the real problems are. So maybe then you make a slightly better abstraction, simpler model, slider down, and then you compare that model against the data that you have. Say, well, here are the differences between the data and the model that you think you're executing. Yeah. Commercial tools should do that better. They're not doing that very well.
Following up on that, also, when you then, for example, leave rework steps out of your model in order to see where are deviations from your, for example, happy flow.
Uh-huh. So, well, if you explicitly would like to say, well, let's focus on rework, right? As an example, say, well, I want to minimize rework, then you should not leave it outdoors your models because you want to explicitly see this, that it happened. The sliders we generally have are not that specific. So you can't control an area of the model where you would like to abstract, right? It would actually be a very nice research project. How would you do this? I would like to see rework in this part of the model, but everything else can be abstracted away. That's an interesting question. However, if you make a model by hand that is very abstract on most parts, but very specific on another, and you do alignments, then you can focus on the deviations precisely in this area that you're interested in. So it's a bit of a... there might be some manual work required to make these models, but then you can really analyze them. And a nice example of that is the work of Elam Ramazani. She introduced the idea of making rules as general declarative rules. There will be a session on declarative mining also later today or this week. But declarative rules translate into Patrinet. You do alignments and you actually find deviations, not necessarily with respect to a whole model, but with respect to a very specific rule. Like you should execute this activity as often as you do this.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask, how much are, for example, alignments used in the industry, and for example, in tools like Celonis? Do you have information about that?
That's a challenging question. So first of all, we can't do this on directly follows graphs, right? Because they do not have clear semantics. So that's the first step. In industry, very often we're still looking at directly follows graphs, and then alignments don't really help. There are some commercial tools that actually do this, right? They allow you to make BPMN models or to discover BPMN models. The BPMN models they discover are very often these flower type models, so you should use the handmade ones. And then they can actually do some alignment things. What industry struggles with is how do you intuitively let the user interpret this? We started today, Josep started today by saying that Celonis was the first company that said you don't have to be a process mining expert to do process mining. But I think you do have to be a process mining expert still today to correctly interpret what an alignment shows you. And that's that's their struggle. We're doing some projects, for example, with UiPath, where we're trying to help them do this. And they have similar visualizations as were shown by Sander, right? These red arcs showing, well, this was often skipped, but that is an explanation. Like this activity is often skipped. Like that's an explanation that you then need to project onto the model somehow. So that's where the challenge is, not the algorithmics, but in the interpretation. Yep.
Thank you for having prepared the task for us so that we can stay active
after lunch.
My question is, could you briefly describe the current status of all the other key performance indicators regarding conformance checking? So the token-based replay and also the alignments, they are there for the fitness. And what is current status with precision, generalization, and simplicity? Are there other algorithms and...
Very nice question. Let's talk about that tomorrow.
Okay, so we will touch on them. Cool.
Well, there's one more over there, and then...
It's just the last one. I'm answering the other friend that it's over there. Like at least with Celonis, I know that depending on your source system, for example, if it's SAP, we have more or less an idea what will be like an ideal path inside SAP. So we compare what we have obtained with the one that we consider the happy path. Yep. So we say, so we have a deviation here or there. Yep. So you have like the standard tables, you have the standard proxies, and that's it. Yeah. Otherwise, you have to ask a proxies expert, someone that knows the business inside. Otherwise, you have no parameter.
No, exactly. So for some standard processes, you actually have sort of industry-accepted reference models, right? You know how it's supposed to happen, and then you can look at deviations already with respect to those reference models. Yeah, true. it often happens. So I mentioned the BPI challenge. I'm organizing this now already for a few years. We're trying to publish data, real life data from companies, and then ask the community to show what you can do with it. For the last 2 years, it didn't work. I could not convince a company to do this because that's a trust relationship, and it's very hard to build trust from a Teams or Zoom screen. But what we notice is that companies are very much willing to share data, for example, the purchase-to-pay process. Right? Every company has it. There's no competitive element there. They can share data for how they execute their purchase-to-pay. But they are not the interesting processes. Right? The interesting things, for at least for me, are their primary processes. How do you actually do your business? I would love to see more data like that published. But that's going to be a challenge. Anyway. Yep.
Thank the speaker, I just wanted to say.
Yep, thank you very much.